Hello, my name's Sally Thorne, and I'm your Director at Large for Research for CANO, and very excited to have the opportunity to talk to you about trying to engage in strategies that will help you be successful in writing for publication. I'd like to start with getting started and just thinking about who you are and what it is that you might want to publish. And this sounds like a very early place to start, since you probably wouldn't be looking at this if you hadn't already thought about it. But I think it's quite helpful to think about who you are in relation to the things that you want to write about. Have you spent enough time to understand the current state of the science if you're going to try and write something that advances it? Have you got a thought about what your original angle is on the topic? You may have been studying something if you're in a clinical role, focusing on something that is new and innovative. You might have been reading up on things. You might have been taking courses if you're in a graduate program. So you may well have a pretty good understanding of what the current state of knowledge is and be able to identify what the next logical, interesting thing is that ought to be published in the literature. But it is useful to just step back and think before you begin this process. Am I at a point, and do I understand what needs to be written? Well, assuming that you've actually identified something that you could contribute and that you're excited about and that you're well positioned to write about, the next thing is to think about a journal. In the olden days, we would think about a journal from the perspective of who the audience is and who reads it. But as we know nowadays, everything is accessible online, and everything is indexable online. So the issue here is trying to make sure that you identify a journal that will reach your intended audience. Now, your likelihood of getting accepted in a journal is much higher if the thing you're writing about is consistent with the aims and scope. And every journal on their website will articulate aims and scope, which is your best cue as to what that journal thinks its audience is, who it's trying to collect papers to speak to, and to send something in that doesn't quite fit a journal's aims and scope is never really a good plan. So do have a look at that. The other thing that you can certainly do is look back through back copies of a journal, online or in a library, and just reflect on, is the thing that you want to write, does it have the look and feel of the kinds of papers that are written? Is it written in a style and toward an audience and at a level of theoretical development and technical skill that is consistent with the papers that that journal publishes? So it's very useful to go through that exercise when you're thinking about a journal. Certainly most journals will have an identifiable audience. Our own Canadian Association of Oncology Nurses Journal, CONJ, aims itself toward primarily an audience of cancer nurses in Canada, but certainly it is online accessible to the world internationally. So the papers that would be accepted into that journal would be the ones that are most likely to be of interest to that primary audience and secondarily to the wider group. So those are the key factors. There's a couple of other things to keep in mind, though. Increasingly, people are concerned about the credibility and the reputation of a journal. And while in the past we used to use that term quite loosely, saying it's a highly respected journal in its field, now we actually have some data that can either help or complicate that matter. So it is useful to be aware of the impact factor, particularly if you're interested in trying to build your research credibility, if you're aiming to get yourself admitted into a doctoral program or trying to increase your strength for applying for fellowships or something like that. It's useful to be aware of aiming to publish in the higher impact factor journals that are suitable to the kind of paper that you're trying to write. It's certainly not a hard and fast metric, and you don't want to over-respond to it, but it's also useful to be aware that those that have an impact factor have been in the business for some time. They've developed that credibility. So even if it isn't just the highest, it's certainly one of the respected journals if it has an impact factor at all. Many journals will not have one, and that's partly because of the cost of collecting the data that's required to begin and get accepted into the program that actually measures this and reports this. So of the about 500 journals in which nurses are likely to publish, usually only about 120 will actually have an impact factor. So it's a thing to consider, but to take it into consideration critically. And don't discount a journal just because it doesn't have an impact factor, but if you are aiming to really represent the strongest case you can, you may want to be aware of it. Another comment I want to make about journal credibility is to be aware of the increasing availability of the entity we call open access predatory journals. And this is the huge explosion in the open access world of fee-based journals that will charge you $1,000 or $2, but very rapidly put you through a peer review process and publish. While it may be very, very tempting to have your paper published quickly, I would be cautious of these journals that don't have credibility, don't have established editorial boards, may not have any scholars involved in the editorial process. And there are websites available that can help you identify which are those journals. Sometimes they have a name that sounds very like a journal that is credible. Nursing Research is a very credible research journal, but Nurse Researcher, for example, might be a variation on it that could be taken up by one of these journals. So be aware of the newer journals. Open access is not a problem, and although most open access journals will charge a fee, many journals will offer the opportunity for people who have the wherewithal to pay the fee to join them. And that really allows everybody, whether they've got a subscription or not, to gain access to the paper. It's well worth the fee, particularly if you have funding from a research grant and the granting body wants some of your findings to be open access. So these are things to consider. Then the last thing about selecting a journal that I'd like to say is that many times you don't get lucky on the first hit. And this is the reality of being in the world of writing for publication. So I always recommend that people think about having a plan B. Should it happen that you get a rejection, you're not going to be too demoralized, so you know where the next journal is that you would send it to. Well, once you've got your journal and you're starting to write, you want to be thinking about finding your voice, aligning what it is that you want to say and the way in which you want to say it with the culture of writing within that particular journal. Is it a journal that's speaking to clinicians and it's trying to ensure that the terminology is not too highfalutin and is as accessible as it needs to be for that audience? Or is it a journal that positions itself within a scholarly tradition that has its own language? So it's important to try and figure out who you are and how you write, which may be quite different than you've written in your academic programs or you've written in clinical reports. So finding that voice that is your own writer's voice. It's also important, in my view, to position yourself as yourself. If you're a beginner in the field or you're just entering into research or projects in your clinical field, you don't need to write as if you are a world-established expert. It's quite useful and actually much more productive to think about how it is that someone at your particular position in this constellation would be talking about this particular phenomenon. As a clinician, I see this kind of thing every day. That kind of comment would make much more sense than something that sounds as if you had no clinical knowledge but had been studying something theoretically for years. Also, consider the issue of authorship and ownership. At one point historically, it was quite important for people to demonstrate that they could publish alone as a sole author. Nowadays, we do so much of our work collaboratively, and there's often a team involved. There are international publishing ethics And those are available in almost all journal websites, so they're very easily accessible. And it's quite important to make sure that all of those individuals who have contributed fully in an authorly way are credited with authorship. But similarly, people who have just been friendly to you or edited a manuscript or given you encouraging words along the way would not have qualified for authorship. So there are very clear rules with regard to how much involvement in a piece of writing would need to occur before someone could be considered an author. And we don't, no reputable journal will encourage ghost authorship of people who didn't really play a role, or excluding people who did play a role. In addition, if somebody has been helpful to you but not at the co-author level, then you might consider acknowledgments. And again, you wouldn't do that without the individual's permission. But being aware that there are many ways in which you can give appropriate credit to the other individuals that might have been involved in the project. As you're starting to write, you're also clarifying what type of an article is it. Is it a research article? A straightforward research article has a fairly typical structure. Although each journal may ask you to format it in a particular way, call your headings certain things. Is it a clinical practice article, a review paper, or a commentary? You'll need to be aware that the journal you're thinking about actually accepts that kind of paper. And if they do, there may be different expectations in the author guidelines that are always available online for each journal, but there'll be different expectations with regard to formatting and length. Sometimes people make this mistake of having a paper that isn't clearly one type or another, and that becomes quite difficult on the journal editing side to be able to know how to deal with it. So you're far safer to try and ensure that to the extent possible, your article conforms to the types of article that that journal is willing to accept. Now, mapping and drafting your paper. You will have looked carefully and meticulously at the author guidelines. It's really important to pay attention to them. They give you lots of information about what the maximum word length is, how to structure it. And in each case, you do need to pay careful attention to all the cues that you're given in the author guidelines with regard to how to organize your paper. But as you're writing, it's often useful to think about those author guidelines well in advance, so you can say, okay, I'm having to argue this in 5,000 words. So how much time can I put to the background and the literature review before I get into talking about my method and my findings? Being aware of that can really help you structure your argument in advance. And it's also often difficult to really compress all the wonderful things you want to say into a short 15-page manuscript, for example. But you do need to think about that and say, what is it that I can say in this? I won't be able to say everything that I said in my master's thesis of 100 pages, but which are the parts of the argument that will make for a coherent whole as an article. So it's quite important to be thinking about that total package and how you can use that to really craft an excellent argument. That helps you think about how much depth and detail you can provide in each issue and what slice of a paper or an larger argument you're going to be able to fit in. As you're writing, it's also quite important to be thinking about the question of aligning this paper with other manuscripts. And many times, particularly when you're a graduate student and doing some major work like a thesis or a dissertation, or you're a clinician and taking on a clinical project, you may be enthusiastic and be able to identify quite a number of papers that you could write about this particular thing. And you want to be quite careful about not overdoing it and trying to craft too many manuscripts. You know you can only submit a manuscript to one journal at a time. Once it's gone into the journal, you need to await a decision on that before it can go somewhere else. But often people will have two manuscripts that have a linkage. They may be two parts of the same study or the literature review versus the findings of a particular study. And there's guidelines and rules with regard to how to avoid the problem that's sometimes called salami slicing, which is just slicing the total project a little bit too thin so that the individual publications that you produce from it are more similar than they ought to be, and put you at risk for being seen as potentially self-plagiarizing, which would be quite a serious ethical error in the publishing world. So you'll see the reference, the fuller reference to that at the end of these slides for if you're interested for future reference. Also, try and be a little bit careful about how you reference your other work. If the paper you're writing does refer to a study that either has been published elsewhere or is in process and may be published elsewhere, then it is quite useful to be able to make sure you're clear in that reference and say this is a part of a larger study and link where the other publications are or are expected to be. And that will provide an editor and reviewers some real clarity to be sure that they understand the particular part that your paper is going to be representing. Of course, every manuscript does have to stand on its own. You can't sort of say, before you read this argument, go and read something else I published last year. Each one will need to have enough coherence so that it will stand on its own, even if it also references to other things. The last thought I'd have here in aligning with other manuscripts is that it is useful to think about and make sure you avoid preempting your own evolving work. And by that, I'm thinking about the beginning thoughts you have when you're entering a large project, for example, a master's thesis research. You very often want to be able to write about the state of the science or something like that. Sometimes, having done a literature review, you feel as if you've got some comments that you're prepared to make. But the hard part is that once you've written that, here's the state of the science paper, you can't really do that again 2 years later. And sometimes people don't really take account of where they are likely to be and how much more well-informed they might be another year or two down the road when trying to, in their eagerness to publish something, send something out. Once something's been published, it's there, it's on your record, it stays with you for life. So you don't want to publish something that will really preclude you from publishing something very similar that might have been more well-developed and more informed down the way. As you're writing, just as you thought about developing your own voice, you really also have to develop your own writing voice and working style. Everybody's different, but it's very useful to talk to other people and get a feel for how people write. Some of us need to have their houses totally clean and all the housework done and all the distractions away. Others work best with a little bit of chaos and noise. And over time, as you develop your own sense of yourself, it's well worth practicing with other ways of doing things. Do you do it a draft first online? Do you scribble in notes? How do you do this? But really develop and refine your own working style so that you get to know yourself as a writer. You get to know what works for you, what allows you to be successful, and where your stumbling bits are. None of us get born comfortable writers and straightforward writers. It's hard work on everybody's part. So talking to other people and sharing stories about how people have overcome some of the hurdles in being confident about writing and being comfortable with writing and develop that. In your writing, it's also useful to really capitalize on the times when you're really focusing intensely on what you're doing, paying careful attention to all those arguments and wrestling with the sentence and words, and then taking some distance to step back from it for an hour or a few days so that you can come back at it and reflect on what you're doing. So capitalizing on being in the work and intensely involved and being somewhat distant. Lots of techniques available for that. I'd also recommend that you really pay attention to the hard slogging of copy editing. Most of us find the dumping out some wonderful narrative the easier part, but going back to it to really look hard at what you're doing and why you're doing it can be really quite it's hard on your brain and frustrating. It's not as much fun, but pay attention to your own common errors. Pay attention to the feedback that you get from anybody, whether it's supervisors or course advisors or colleagues. If people tell you you tend to use the passive voice too much, then make sure you figure out what the passive voice is and build into your own list of common errors, reading through your work for that particular thing. Read through again for the next thing, and really pay attention to that copy editing work. That really is what refines your capacity to be very fine-tuned and accurate as a writer over time. All of the manuscripts you're likely to submit for publication will require referencing. And besides the technical requirements of being very careful to attend to the referencing format that each journal has, and each journal will be slightly different, so you need to pay very close attention to that. So besides the technical things, there's also the conceptual issue of what you're referencing and why you're referencing it. And this is an art form. It's something that many people find that they don't really get until they've been in graduate school, and they've had people give them the feedback that says, you're doing way too much referencing. You're referencing every idea, so that they can move back and judge which are the things that are important to reference and what is it that we can say is probably more general knowledge that would not require a reference. So that's an art form. Some people find they reference too infrequently and they need to give credit to authorities. Others find that in trying hard to give those credit to authorities, they overdo it. And finding that right balance is really quite useful. Also, it's quite important to be aware of understanding what you're referencing. Somebody can have said a particular thing, but a scholar will want to know why they said that particular thing. Because when you are writing for an informed audience, they won't simply notice that a particular author said something, but in knowing what that author's project was, why that author was writing, what contribution that author made, there are a lot of signifiers and inferences with regard to what that point means. So if you were to reference something that did get written, but that it was in a not a very credible source, or in a source that didn't actually wasn't actually consistent with the argument you're making, you can have run into some difficulty with your reviewers. So your credibility will be not only being accurate in referencing, but also being thoughtful about intelligently referencing those sources that are credible witnesses to the ideas that you're trying to establish when you're writing. As you write, it's very useful to get some friends involved. And I don't mean the kinds of friends and colleagues that say, that looks okay to me, or I think I can understand what you're saying. The best friends when you're writing are people who are really willing to be critical and to point out those places where somebody may misinterpret or misunderstand what you're trying to express. So the best friends you have in the writing world will be people who can spot those for you and therefore give you the guidance you need to be able to preempt those misunderstandings by being as clear as possible. It's really important also to learn to read your own work as your own worst critic. Step back from it for a little while, go back and say, I'm going to look at my paper today to see all of the really problematic things that got written, all the things that don't make sense. So you explicitly use a little bit of humor, but learn how to be your own worst critic. And that can be a really useful skill to develop, often developing it along with friends. And through that process, really trying to figure out when you're ready to submit. Some of us are so eager and we've worked so hard and we're so impatient to be published that we sort of short-circuit the reading and proofreading process and push submit too quickly. If something has been submitted just a bit too quickly, you really might jeopardize your chance of it being successful. So it's often worth taking that extra time and care and caution and really paying careful attention to making sure that what you submit is meticulous and accurate, and there's no technical problems with referencing and all of that. Others of you will find that you get so anxious about the referencing and the proofreading, and we all know you could read a paper forever and always find something, that you're hesitant to push that submit button. So if you're more of a cautious type, you may need to be able to just help yourself come to some comfort to say, okay, I've done as much as I can for now. It's time to push that submit button. It's a lot about learning yourself. When you're actually submitting a process, most journals have a submission process online nowadays. Not all, but many do. And in the olden days, inquiries to the editor about whether they might be interested in your paper were appropriate. It's not very often appropriate now, but there are a few occasions. For example, if you have a journal that's recently had a special edition on a particular topic and you're wanting to submit something in that particular topic, it might be quite appropriate to say, I realize you've just had a whole edition on this. Are you still open to papers on this particular topic? That might be a good way for you to quickly know whether there was at least a general interest. An editor will not normally give you a preliminary an opinion as to whether it looks from the abstract as if your paper is good enough. So I think that there's no particular payoff in that. But only contact an editor when you really have a genuine question that requires editorial consultation. The editor is likely to be the one that's continuing to shepherd your journal through the review process. And if you've begun your correspondence by revealing your sloppiness or unwillingness to have read the author guidelines, you're kind of setting the stage in a way that's not necessarily helpful. So if you do contact an editor, make sure it's done professionally and thoughtfully and where appropriate. Follow those instructions really carefully. Read them carefully. I know they're way too long most of the time, and it hurts your head to read them. And they're different for every journal, but it is well worth preparing your manuscript in the manner in which you're being asked to. And also reviewing that package before you press the submit button. You're always asked to preview it, but really look at it carefully. Just make sure you haven't got orphan blips or pages in the wrong sequence or something like that. Because where people have made sort of significant errors and there's some problem they ought to have corrected, it just conveys the idea of you're not being as careful as you ought to be. So those are really quite important steps in demonstrating that you can really adhere to the process. That's unfortunately a requirement of the publishing world. Eventually, and it may take some time, for a paper to go through the review, but eventually a decision will come. It may come very quickly if the journal editor reasons that your paper isn't suitable for that particular journal or it would not pass the review process. So a decision can be made quite quickly, and that's really to help you go on with the next journal rather than waiting for the bad news. But where it goes out for review, reviewers, it's very difficult to get the reviewers you want. It's voluntary time on their part, and editors certainly don't want to irritate them by bugging them too much to submit. So it is a little bit beyond the control. Most editors will try and help that process move through in a timely manner, but it can be quite a wait. I'd say the average time would be somewhere between 6 and 8 weeks for a journal, but different journals may have different time limits, and some certainly try hard to make that sooner, more like 4 to 6 weeks. But that's pretty fast in the publishing world. Eventually, that email will come that is your decision letter, and it will say one of various things: that your paper's been accepted. Very few papers get accepted uncritically with no revisions. I've been doing it for a very long time, and I've had very few of those. But it occasionally can happen the first time around. Not likely. The other more likely choices are that you're being asked for minor revisions, which generally signal an enthusiasm toward considering publishing, but some adjustments that would need to be made, and the final decision will be held until after those adjustments have been attended to. But if the word minor or something like that is there in the letter, that can give you quite an encouraging word. If the major revisions are being requested, or significant revisions, something like that, that usually means that there's still a possibility that it may be accepted, but that the reviewers will need to see what you're able to contribute in response to their comments. And you certainly shouldn't assume that that means that your eventual publication is a slam dunk. But the opportunity to do revisions certainly signals that the conversation has remained open. The journal has not decided that this is not a suitable topic or that you aren't capable of writing it. So you're given guidance in that context to be able to move forward to the next step. I would never take major revisions as a totally negative signal unless the things they're telling you you have to revise are completely beyond your capacity or will. So what you're trying to do in that decision letter is really read between the lines and say, what kind of a signal are they giving me? And if you're not used to reading those signals, it might be worth showing that letter to somebody else, somebody who's more experienced in writing, and say, how should I interpret this? Should I say it's a lost cause and go somewhere else, or should I revise? The most common is some form of the revise and resubmit option, that you have the opportunity to resubmit a revised version. You will normally be given some comments by the reviewers. They may be direct comments, or they may have been reworked and summarized by the editor. Some journals will send you the comments directly with no editing, and so if there are harsh or inappropriate things there, you may see them. Those can be difficult. They can be quite a sting if somebody says this is a ridiculous argument or this is not well written or something like that. So just be prepared that some may come through unfiltered. Other times the editor may have filtered them so as to make sure that you get a clear message. But reviewers are individuals, and they come from different perspectives, and it is not at all unexpected or unusual to have two reviewers with slightly different takes on things. That may be a reasonable situation, because it may be that each of the reviewers sees a similar problem but is actually pointing you in a slightly different direction. It might be helpful to do it this way. This might resolve that problem. They may have seen the same problem and be giving you two different pieces of advice rather than contradicting each other. But it can be sometimes difficult to look at a series of 2 or 3 reviews, particularly if they're detailed and comprehensive, and recognize that sometimes they appear to be in conflict. One says you've got to do way more of this in this section. The other says this section, the same section is way too long. You've got to reduce it, and you will need to think about that. Often in the letter that the editor has constructed, you will find some cues that might help you with that. The letter might indicate that certain reviewers' comments need to be taken more seriously than others. It might summarize the core message that you're to take from the reviews. But look through carefully and read it carefully, and read it more than once so that you fully understand what the concerns are. And you make an informed decision as to whether you're prepared to resolve it. There are times when the reviewer comments make it very clear that you would have to rewrite in a way that's not consistent with your idea, and therefore you may not be able to do it. But for the most part, reviewers are offering something that you can work with and figure out how to go forward. You're always nowadays given an opportunity to respond to the reviewer comments when you resubmit, and you're asked to give a detailed explanation of the changes you made. So here's the time in which you can list the particular questions that are raised by those reviewers, and in each case you can say, reviewer number 1 asked me to do this. This is how I've responded. Sometimes you'll do exactly what they said because they were good ideas. Other times you'll find that you can't, and you have a particular reason for that. And it may be instead of not doing it, that you've clarified something or developed something so that the misunderstanding that you think the reviewer had is no longer there. So it's a good way to explain how you've thought through your response. And there's an art form to responding non-defensively and constructively. You don't know if your comments will go back to those reviewers. So you certainly don't want to say reviewer number one clearly doesn't know what he or she is talking about in the event that your comments may go back to that reviewer. So responding non-defensively, showing appreciation for the ideas that actually did help you think through or clarify something, which is very often, even in the worst reviews, there's something you can work from. And then being thoughtful in explaining why certain comments you may not have been able to take up, or you've chosen a different way than was suggested to resolve that particular problem. But you will want to think carefully and thoughtfully about those constructive responses. There are a few further resources that are here listed on these slides, and I'll just leave it up for a moment so you can check back and jot those down. I've referred to them earlier in this presentation, and so they're very useful guides to this writing process. There are many more resources available on writing in the literature. Here's a second slide of those. All things that I'd recommend, really useful resources if you want to actually think about that writing properly, things to do and not do that are going to increase your likelihood of being successful. Writing is a really exciting and complex process. It's something that allows you to sharpen your thinking by articulating that thinking in the written form in such a way that it's going to speak to other people. It's difficult, it can be painful, it can hurt your head sometimes, but it is so wonderful when nurses take that time out and really take that brave step to enter the world of being in the conversation in publishing, to put their ideas out there so others can read them and respond to them. And I hope the comments that I've made throughout this podcast have really excited you rather than discouraged you from engaging in the written, in the world of writing. There's so much that cancer nurses have to contribute to the world of ideas, whether it be to their fellow cancer nurses, whether it be sharing their knowledge about cancer to nurses who are working in other fields, whether it be to the larger oncology world to try and articulate a unique nursing angle of vision on those particular problems. But there's so much that we can contribute, and of course there's so many ideas that don't yet find their way into the written world such that other nurses can pick them up and use them. So if you're at all thinking about writing, I really encourage you to take those next steps. And happy writing. It's been great talking to you, and I wish you all very well in your writing projects.